All right, we are on air. Google just told me that we have up to 8 hours. It seems kind of excessive, but
Yeah.
I don't think we'll go quite that long, so don't worry.
Okay, that's good to hear.
How are you doing today? What's going on?
Yeah, I'm good. I've just been reading up for my master's dissertation.
Okay,
Um, hmm So, but yeah, nothing else really. How's it
cool.
going with you?
Oh, I'm well. Do you want to tell us about that? Tell us about your master's dissertation?
Yeah, so we're looking at people's grades at the age of 16 and trying to predict uh, predict their grades from their genes, essentially. And to do that, we sort of combine previous genetic studies that have looked at other traits that predict grades, but also predict other physical traits, and then put them together to see how the genes predict people's grades in this big twin study sample that we have at my university. So,
Okay.
so it seems like quite a lot of the variance in people's grades at school is a result of genetic differences, and we're trying to find out how much of that we can predict and what kind of traits that might be related to.
Okay, interesting. So you are working on predicting grades from genes, and
Uh-huh.
you're working with a twin study. You said, is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's a unique twin study that your university has done recently, or what?
Yeah, so it's an ongoing twin study that's been going on for about I think 21 or 20 21 years now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, do you have a sense of what your findings are yet, or no?
So there have been some previous studies looking at similar outcomes, and I think the maximum amount of variance that they've been able to predict is about 10 to 12%. So we're trying to improve on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And so you expect to find what previous research has found.
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. And so, um, what is your kind of unique personal contribution to all of this for your dissertation? Like, are you working as one member of a larger team, or do you have a unique kind of original spin that you're doing personally?
Um, so, so I'm going to be including more data sets into the sample, so that will hopefully increase the predictive power. And then also doing a lot of reading to see what traits correlate with academic success.
Other traits, you mean?
Yeah,
Traits other than, yeah. Good.
so lots of psychological traits are influenced by genes and environments, and sort of looking at which traits it might be related to is, um, I think, a little understudied. So I'd be interested in looking at how loads of those traits sort of um, combine with each other to influence people's grades at school.
Okay, right. So, what are your hunches on that regarding traits?
So it seems as though a lot of the variance is predicted by differences in people's intelligence, but there are also other psychological traits that are important.
Right.
So for example, conscientiousness, which is a measure of like work ethic and openness to experience, and then there are some others like motivation and self-control and um, yeah, so striving for success seems to be another trait that's associated with higher grades
Okay.
at school. Yeah.
And striving. Okay, that's interesting. So, striving for success, you see as a separate trait that's not just loaded onto like conscientiousness or something like that.
Yeah, so I think it's associated with it, but it's not completely predicted by it.
Okay. So, is
Yeah.
striving for success, is that kind of like the grit stuff or no?
Um, I think I'd have to look into it, but I think conscientiousness and grit seem to be the same measure. Um,
Right. So I mean, I'm
yeah.
not an expert on any of this by any stretch, but I did not too long ago read Grit, And I think if I recall correctly, she has this idea that she talks about sort of two things, like I think passion and perseverance are the words that she uses.
Right.
Um, so I think she talks a fair bit about that kind of, yeah, that drive
Hmm.
for success as being something that's kind of unique or a significant predictor that
Yeah.
I guess isn't on some level separable from conscientiousness. But I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should probably read more before trying to explain, but I've been mostly focusing on the relationship between intelligence and academic success so far.
Right. So, okay, Saloni. Now, isn't it the case though that if you're interested in genetics and intelligence, you're basically a Nazi?
Well, I mean, I think it is. It's really important to study just sort of out of intellectual curiosity, but also because of how intelligence is related to so many important important traits. So it's related to better health outcomes and um, sort of more job success and increased job performance. And so trying to study this is not necessarily something that you do in a sort of deterministic or authoritarian way, but it's sort of trying to help individuals um, like improve their chances at succeeding in the world. So I
Right.
wouldn't say it's yeah.
Yes, of
For
course.
me, it's more of a thing about like empowerment and trying to help people understand how they can succeed better.
Nice. Yeah, well put. I think I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. I was just
Hmm.
busting your chops a little bit. And
Yeah,
lots of people do think like that, so it's kind of good that you went over that. Um,
yeah.
so I mean, how did you get into all the stuff that you're interested in? How did you
Um,
come into this stuff?
yeah, so that's a good question. So I've always been sort of interested in biology and evolution, and when I was growing up as a teenager, I wasn't really sure of what to study, and so I was interested in neuroscience and genetics, and I decided to do an undergraduate degree in biomedical science because I felt as though that encompassed both of those things, and it also encompassed a lot of other things. And so, if I wanted to go into a different route for my career, I could just use that as a plan B.
Right.
But it was only much later when I read The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker that I realized that this was actually one field that combined both like psychology and neuroscience and genetics. Um, and I decided to continue into behavioral genetics, which I'm doing right now.
Right, right. Cool. Well, are you, and I know you're based in the UK, but I
Uh-huh.
forget, were you born and raised in the UK, or what's your larger?
No, so I was born in India, but I grew up in Hong Kong, and I moved here for university.
Nice. So very cosmopolitan.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I noticed that you just retweeted AJ Verghese. I actually went to university with him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, we're buddies. Well, not buddies like to this day. I haven't stayed in touch, but we've actually chatted not too long ago. But we were on the debate team together in university.
Oh, wow. That's cool. Yeah, I don't really know him that well, but yeah, that sounds cool.
Yeah, no, I just remembered I saw that on your timeline today. He's cool.
Okay.
um, cool. So that's an interesting story.
Hmm.
Yeah. So you and I know each other basically just from the internet. We did
Hmm.
meet that one time, which was nice. But
Yeah.
I kind of came across your account a while ago, and you have a very, a very thoughtful Twitter account. You seem to put a lot of, time and care and attention
Hmm.
into tweeting, high quality content, I would say, around,
Thanks.
things like, oh, you're very welcome. Things like, genetics and psychology and this sort of stuff. And
Yeah.
you kind of dabble a little bit in some of the hot topics, like the culture wars topics. You
Uh-huh.
seem to be kind of, I think, very sympathetic to free speech and interested in kind of that
Yeah.
side of some of these debates. But you're also
Yeah.
not extremely political. I don't think, is that fair to
Hmm.
say?
Yeah.
You seem to be your personal brand, if I may say so, seems to be kind of focused on kind of curating kind of objective science as a
Yeah.
kind of contribution to kind of the hot button debates. Is that fair to say, or how do you see? So the reason I ask is just because you have quite a nice little online platform, and I think a
Hmm.
lot of people really appreciate the angle that you bring to things.
Right.
So is that how you see your brand or your kind of personal goal or work on the internet, or do you see it differently?
So I guess I would say yeah, but it's sort of evolved over time. So I think I was more interested in the culture wars maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it sort of seems to put a lot of strain on people, and it becomes a little too much to handle. So I've been trying to. I'm still interested in the topics that people
Yeah.
talk about, but I'm trying to sort of branch out into just science and genetics and psychology.
Right. Right. Well, I think you have a nice style of, kind of, I think often referring to some of the hot button topics, but maybe more
Uh-huh.
implicitly than explicitly.
Oh yeah, yeah,
So I think there's often a kind of subtext in a lot of the stuff that you put out, but it is,
yeah,
a very thoughtful kind of careful, objective angle on things. So
yeah. Thank you.
yeah, you're very welcome. I think that's probably how people kind of see your brand, and why people
Hmm.
appreciate your persona, if you will.
Right.
How did you get into? I mean, it's very hard when you're a graduate student
Hmm.
to put a lot of thought and care into public, intellectual work of whatever kind. Even something as simple
Yeah.
as maintaining like a well a well maintained Twitter persona is
Right.
is quite hard in grad school, when you're trying to basically like spend all of your time and energy to get boned up on the skills and techniques that you need to
Yeah.
get boned up on, and also to produce the work that you need to produce.
Hmm.
So not to mention the kind of like anxieties about, kind of establishing yourself as a respected scholar. So it's actually kind of rare that you see,
Yeah.
graduate students doing a lot of this kind of public intellectual work. So I mean, maybe I'd be curious to hear, just how did you get into cultivating a kind of internet persona?
Yeah. So I think it started off as more of a hobby, like something that I just enjoyed doing because I felt as though there were a lot of topics that were difficult to talk about with many of my friends in real life, and yet online there's like a space where I feel like there's a space where you can talk about all these issues and hear all of these interesting ideas and perspectives, um, and I think I was sort of mostly attracted by that, and I wasn't really thinking about the audience that I was building during that time, but in the last year or so, I think my audience has sort of risen kind of exponentially almost, and I've become more conscious of the things that I'm tweeting about. So trying to be more objective and more introspective in terms of trying to make sure that I'm actually practicing what I preach and not just simply saying things that everyone's expected to say.
Right. Yeah, that's so hard to do, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's so tempting. I mean, yeah, the social media really does just kind of, it primes some of our worst tendencies, I think. And it's
yeah,
so funny how
yeah,
strong it is. Like, because no matter how self-aware you are of it, it's just like this constant kind of tugging at some of your most
exactly.
like base like instincts.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's funny though. So do any of your advisors in your graduate program, are they active on the internet? Do they follow you? Or is there any kind of even
Um,
awareness of this, or are they kind of just more traditional academics who don't really do much on the internet?
yeah, I think it's more of the latter. So I kind of keep my academic stuff separate from my online presence, I guess. And so there isn't that much overlap or much, yeah, there isn't much going on between those things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's actually kind of the same too. Like, I'm still surprised to this day how many academics just don't even do anything online or pay any attention to anything online.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of I find it to this day very surprising, just because in my view of things right now, almost all of the action is online in terms of like, really
Right.
genuinely moving, interesting, developing intellectual advancements.
Hmm.
The internet seems to be almost completely where it's at.
Yeah.
So yeah, I find it very odd, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I find it even more. So when I was talking about how I found Twitter a place that you could sort of discuss, I guess, different ideas that you then were normal in everyday life. I feel like that's happened. That has sort of amplified itself, and that so now because I've been online for so long and I've read so much stuff on like a variety of issues, it becomes even harder to talk to people who are not on social media about the same things because they just don't share the same information about the topics that you're talking about.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Because
Yeah,
on the internet, you can get super into whatever it is you're interested in.
exactly.
And when you
Yeah.
have to kind of like do socializing in, uh, you know, corporeal form with other human beings, it's all of a sudden like you're not allowed to just be super interested in what you're interested in.
Right.
You have to go back to like being normal and averaging out your interests with like everyone else in
Yeah.
the room.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting and peculiar kind of psychological struggle for
Yeah.
contemporary human
Yeah.
beings who live mostly on on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on like what's going on with all this and how the internet is kind of driving a wedge between like these professions such as academia, because
Hmm.
part of it I think is that, well, people that like doing things related to, public communication will gravitate towards doing it, and those that are less inclined to do that sort of thing will stay out of the internet game.
Right. Yeah.
But but yeah, it's interesting to think about like where that's going to go though,
Hmm.
because it seems to me, I mean, I don't know, this might just be a self-flattering way of thinking about it, because I'm clearly kind of I'm far, to one end in the camp of people who are like who love the internet and who are embracing the internet for all it's
Right.
worth. So I'm
Yeah.
perhaps biased by my view on that, but it seems to me that that will increasingly be where power is distributed. I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
case, but it sure feels like things will increasingly be, in terms of social status and power
Uh-huh.
distributions, it will increasingly be played out through kind of internet influence hierarchies or something like that. And
Yeah.
people like, especially, I'm specifically talking about academia. So like academics
Hmm.
who don't have a foothold in any of those, um, that social sphere that takes place on the internet.
Yeah.
It's hard to see, yeah, where what happens to those people. I mean, I guess that they
Yeah.
might very
Yeah.
well just kind of buckle down and kind of carve out their, protect their own kind of like non-internet traditional brick and mortar institutional kind of like privileges, I guess. And
Right.
maybe you could actually see kind of the internet wing of academics and intellectuals more or less kind of breaking off into their own kind of sphere or something like that.
Hmm.
Maybe a kind of long-term bifurcation. But yeah, I don't know. It's just very fascinating because it's a significant wedge to the point that like I kind of operate in a completely different system of social reference and power distribution than
Yeah.
most of my colleagues do. So it's like I just don't know what the
I,
long run equilibrium of that is.
yeah, and I kind of think a lot of the sort of open science movement and the sort of online like archiving of journal articles is also driving that a lot more than it was in the past.
Right. That's true too. But even that, it's very strange because almost all of the scholarly academic publishing institutions
Hmm.
are doing their damn best to keep everything under kind of traditional locks and keys.
Right.
So it's like
Yeah.
even there's a bifurcation between the people who want to go radical kind of open access on everything
Uh-huh.
and people who still have uh, footholds in kind of the traditional like academic I guess, power structure or whatever you want to call it. I don't
Right.
know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. You know what else is also interesting to me or curious to me? I wonder if you have any kind of thoughts on this.
Hmm.
How a lot of this is kind of conditioned on psychological traits, or at least this is kind of one of my like hypotheses. Like it seemed, but I don't exactly know how to put it. Like on one level, it seems to me that people who are really embracing the internet for intellectual purposes,
Hmm.
like they might be people who are more extroverted or something like that, you know?
Right.
Whereas
I
people
kind
who
of
whereas
I
people who
kind
are
of see it as the opposite.
okay,
I'm not
yeah.
sure.
So go on.
So I don't know. To me, it seems as though people who are active online are more introverted, don't spend much time socializing with friends in real life, and then I feel like the internet makes people a lot more confident about things. So people are, I guess, people are louder and more vocal about their views and a bit nastier as well, I guess. So
Hmm.
I don't know. It seems to me that it sort of selects for
Yeah, so
the
that's
opposite group of people.
you could totally be right, and that's kind of what I meant by when I said that I was confused about it because
Right.
yeah, you could see it just as well how you put it that it actually the internet selects for introverts, but and this is where I would just like someone more experienced in this research to clarify things for me because
Yeah.
it still in some sense if you're super introverted you probably don't even want to go on the internet and right like I mean
Yeah. Yeah.
uh
That's true. Yeah.
and on the other hand like when I think about my academic colleagues who just don't care about the internet and don't want to do it, just are not interested at all.
Hmm.
They're it's I'm not critiquing them or criticizing them in any way at all. I'm just but it does seem to me
Yeah.
that they're linked to that is a certain kind of like shyness or a kind
Right.
of uh, a kind of fear or discomfort with exposing yourself to public, the public
Yeah.
gaze.
Oh, that's true.
So
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And
I.
so I don't know, maybe the introversion extroversion um, spectrum is not the most useful one to describe this, but there
Yeah.
in any event, it definitely seems to be like kind of divergences occurring by conditioning on kind of psychological inclinations of some kind.
Yeah. I kind of wonder if there must be a difference between people who are sort of anonymous online versus people who have their like real names and pictures. I feel as though the second group with their real names must be more of the extroverted, outgoing people versus people who are sort of drawn towards social media just to find their own sort of niche group must be more introverted.
Right. So like would are I'm sure you've taken psychological tests and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
Are you extroverted or introverted or
So I think I sort of lean towards the introverted category.
okay.
Yeah.
So like okay, then you're an interesting example because you're very open on the internet and
Yeah.
you're very friendly and approachable and
Yeah.
in all the times I've chatted with you, you seem like perfectly comfortable
Hmm.
interacting with strangers and you accept invitations to do things like Google Hangouts. So
True. Yeah.
it's very fascinating maybe how the internet um maybe is having very odd or somewhat unpredictable interactions with our traditional kind of psychological
Yeah.
schemas or
Yeah.
something like that. Because in some ways, it's like, yeah, it might be empowering introverts
Hmm.
in a weirdly extroverted way.
Yeah. I think that's probably right.
It's
And I think it
interesting.
makes people feel a lot more confident about voicing their opinions.
Yeah, it definitely makes people more confident, and I guess that can be a good or a bad thing.
Exactly.
It
Yeah.
makes everyone more confident. Yeah, for sure. I think there's also an issue where I feel like I see this a lot that many academics the truth is that their all of their research over the past several years in their career
Hmm.
is it's sort of conducted from the beginning on the presumption that it's only really for academic eyes to consume and to
Right.
judge. And so
Yeah.
it's like I think for a lot of academics, although they're very smart and even do good work,
Uh-huh.
the idea of submitting all of that work to this kind of completely open public
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of judgment is sort of like whoa, hang on. I never signed up to this. This is
Yeah.
not what I did my work for, you know? And I think, yeah, I think it makes a lot of academics anxious, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of people are afraid of communicating their work with the outside world. Maybe just not in terms of the criticism that they might receive, but also perhaps there are personality traits that are more common in academics that make them shyer about things like that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. See, I think on my for my part, like I have certain psychological traits I think that are they're not, you know, prohibitively bad for academia, but they're not very well suited to academia, and they're
Right.
actually kind of favored by kind of the internet game. Like I think
Uh-huh.
um like for me, one of my problems as an academic is I'm not super conscientious. I'm pretty
Right.
conscientious, you know, I'm like conscientious enough to do a PhD and to, you know, to publish articles and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But I'm not high enough on conscientiousness to, you know, I'll never be like a Steven Pinker, you know. So
Right.
but I can like write a lot of crazy shit on Twitter. And I can write like a large volume of blog posts with kind
Yeah.
of like interesting uh and somewhat wacky ideas that probably have high variance in quality, you know.
Right.
So it's like my high variance in quality and my kind
Hmm.
of middle of the road moderate conscientiousness that actually does
Yeah.
really well on the internet,
Yeah.
more so than in academia, where really it's like, you know, the higher it's really like IQ plus conscientiousness. If you're like super high on
Right.
those two, if you're super high on those two things, you can like dominate academia.
Yeah.
But you know, if you're not like in the 99th percentile of those things, like you're gonna not you're it's unlikely that you're gonna like really be super great in there. So
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
just interesting how that plays out.
Yeah.
Have you noticed also, like in your, you know, since you kind of have one foot in academia and one foot in the wild west of the internet, have you noticed like how much people on the internet and just like people out in the world in general, it seems like hate academics? I find this
Oh,
especially on the internet. Like I feel like the people are out with their with their
I have
pitchforks.
noticed it sometimes, but
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends. It seems to be more fraught on the topic that the academics are talking about. So for example, I think there was one event that happened a couple of weeks ago where this economist posted a study that she had done on opioid access and how that affected violent crime afterwards. I think that was it. And it turned into this massive pylon of people who assumed that what she meant was that we should restrict people from taking opioids. And yeah, it's very strange because I feel as though a lot of people sort of they just take away implications of the paper that are not necessarily there, and they judge academics and their work by how people could use their science to justify some policy that they don't like
Oh
to begin
yeah,
with. Yeah,
definitely, definitely. I
yeah,
think it's the worst with kind of like traditional paid media writers or journalists, like people who
right.
basically get a paycheck for, you know, generating like a pretty high volume of commentaries that basically are geared to get clicks in one way or another. Like even
Hmm.
the more highbrow outlets that run on ads or whatever, it's still
Yeah,
ultimately kind of click economy. I mean, the incentives are just so poorly aligned for genuine intellectual communication. So like, you know,
yeah,
journalists have every reason to basically find, you know, the most sensational interpretation of
right.
scientific findings.
Yeah.
And you know, it's so fascinating to watch because left wing outlets will seize on one dimension of a scientific study and
Hmm.
sensationalize it for
Yeah,
clicks on
that's
their
true.
end.
Yeah,
And then the right outlet will take the same study and sensationalize another dimension of
yeah,
it in the opposite direction. And
yeah,
it's like it's really fascinating to watch this. This happens like every day, all of the time.
yeah,
So like
yeah.
how that plays out in the long term, kind of like mental ecology of Western civilization,
Hmm.
is such a fascinating and major question.
Yeah. I was thinking about before how so before I was interested in like social media, used to just take the news that I read for granted and just assume that the journalist was sort of an expert in the field and therefore they were probably right about what they're writing about.
Yeah.
But sort of after being more involved in social media, you notice people take these articles that these journalists write, and then it just turns into this massive debate around some of the things that are written, and sometimes things that are just imagined but not actually in the piece. But it turns into a much larger conversation about the topics than you would have ever been exposed to if you had just read it in your own time.
Right.
And so I feel as though even if there is this incentive towards clickbait journalism, if you're trying to look for, if you're trying to extract knowledge from an issue or from an article, you can do so much better on social media than you can otherwise.
Right. That's a good point. I think I see what you mean. What you mean. Like what you're saying, I think, is that if you are relatively insulated from the bad incentives
Mm-hmm.
to sensationalize and exaggerate or whatever,
Yeah.
then social media is actually probably the best place to do genuine, objective kind of
Right.
information and knowledge sharing and kind of collective truth
Yeah.
seeking or whatever.
Yeah.
But the problem is that social media just happens to be overwhelmingly populated by
Yeah.
actors with like all of the wrong incentives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? That's a really good point because I think that explains kind of an interesting or peculiar feature about the current kind of intellectual ecology, which is
Mm-hmm.
that I feel like it seems that more and more the real kind of movers and shakers of interesting intellectual kind of advancements or progress, and I don't necessarily mean like scientific advancements, I mean kind of
Uh-huh.
like the people that are actually kind of shaking and moving forward popular discussions and conversations
Yeah.
are precisely the people you're talking about. It's like people who are not being paid, people who are not doing,
Right.
they're not being paid by journalistic businesses, and they're also
Mm-hmm.
not being paid by academia, or they might happen to be journalists, or they might happen to be academics, but they're doing perfectly independent things
Yeah.
that that they just happen to be interested in. It's like
Right.
the small groups of people that are doing that sort of stuff are increasingly the drivers of precisely what's kind of interesting and noteworthy and that people talk about. Like I think an interesting
Yeah. Yeah.
example is like this recent dust up with Robin Hanson, and we don't have to get into it
Oh yeah.
if you don't
Yeah.
want to, but like he's a good example of someone who obviously he's an academic, but he's mostly in terms of his intellectual impact, it
Mm-hmm.
mostly comes through his highly independent and free blogging. That's kind of
Right.
it's orthogonal to his academic work, and it's orthogonal to any type of like other paid ventures that he does. It's
Yeah.
just really creative, personal, idiosyncratic, independent thinking. And so
Yeah.
it's like the people that are doing that are increasingly what we talk about in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
think
don't know.
that's right, and I think I think I've noticed that sort of small ideological groups on the internet that we think are small in the sort of in the time that we're looking at them, they turn out to have had a lot of influence if you look at them retrospectively.
Okay.
So they sort of grow in influence and then they sort of shape. So even like small arguments that people have on Twitter suddenly turn into these massive news stories that everyone covers for like a week or so.
Right.
So I feel as though a lot of the news seems to now begin on social media because of things that people start arguing about, and then if you're not on social media, you're kind of missing the boat on a lot of things that could become hot topics in the future.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think ultimately though it's a pretty awesome time for people who are just super interested in particular topics and
Yeah.
who are, anyone who's just basically kind of interested and interesting enough to focus for a little bit of time on topics that they're interested in and just kind of focused enough to put together some observations
Hmm.
on what they're interested in. I mean, for that kind of just pretty normal, everyday, interested and interesting person who wants to kind of think about things and maybe say something, that might
Yeah.
be, useful in some way for that kind of just pretty average, intelligent thinking person. The times have hardly ever been better for that unique type of person, I think, in some sense,
Right.
because for all of these reasons, like all of the people who are getting paid to do intellectual work
Yeah.
are like really in la la land from, I guess like institutional inertia and bad incentives. So it's like if you're just like a fairly intelligent person, like even pretty normal, but just really interested in something, and you have your shit together enough to like write a decent blog post, like
Yeah.
the world is kind of your oyster right now. Like people really
Yeah.
people are really open to hearing from anyone who just genuinely has something to contribute. And so that's like a really, really
Yeah.
beautiful and
I
cool
totally
thing,
agree. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that kind of gets lost in all the lamenting that happens about the internet and social media today, like
Yeah.
everything about fake news and polarization. And there is a lot that's obviously, very socially perverse about the internet today and intellectual
Yeah.
culture. But man, is it a pretty cool moment for, normal people that are just interested in trying to figure some things out and say some things and find people that are also interested in it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Anyways.
think, and unlike with typical, I guess, affiliative sort of brands, it's more driven by, I feel like social media is kind of an equalizer in some ways, that it sort of, it boosts people who would not be seen otherwise, but who are just interesting based on their content.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a beautiful thing. By the way,
Yeah.
I forgot, I should be sharing with you the comments that we're getting, by the way.
Okay.
We're getting a few. They're mostly asking us stuff that we've already naturally talked about anyway. Like
Right.
someone wanted to know about your master's degree and your studies, and
Hmm.
we talked about that. And Tracy Harms is commenting a bit on how some of what we were saying validates the ivory tower accusation against academia, that
Okay. Yeah.
the idea that among academics, what I said before, basically that, I think a lot of academics, they didn't do their work for it to ever be discussed in public. Like they didn't, sign up for
Right.
that. I think Tracy was saying that is consistent with the critique of academia as an ivory tower. And I think that's totally
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Tracy was also mentioning that Robin Hanson's blogging started a long time ago, and that it was independent of his academic work.
Hmm.
And yeah, I agree. And also that, yeah, Robin Hanson made a big splash a long time ago with the idea of idea futures. Right. So
Okay. So,
that's right. Robin Hanson was one of the people who I think is most responsible for popularizing the idea of betting markets.
okay. I
I
didn't know that.
think. I mean, I don't. It's not like he invented betting markets exactly, but
Right.
he,
Yeah.
I forget what he did. He did make some sort of unique contribution. I just forget what it was. And I mean, he's definitely
Hmm.
associated with, the popularization of betting markets and that kind
Right.
of style of rationalism. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Tracy. Thank you for those inputs. It's fun having people chime in. So, all right. So, what else? So obviously we've talked mostly so far about academia because it's the one thing
Hmm.
that I guess what you and I kind of have in common is we
Yeah.
both sort of have one foot in the wacky world of the internet and one foot in academia.
Yeah.
And I think you've said to me before that you're considering some sort of academic career. I think it sounds like you're not totally sure about what your future holds, but you're open to pursuing an academic career. So I part of me is curious, like what your experience has been, because as I said, your Twitter persona is quite careful, I think, and you don't,
Hmm.
you're not exactly an edgelord. You're not, dabbling in,
Yeah.
super dicey, political debates that are highly
Right.
inclined to be villainized. But you do study genetics and you do study
Yeah.
things like that. So that itself is intrinsically kind of politicized enough today. I just wonder, what has been your exposure to, political correctness or whatever you want to call it, and the pressures of that? Have you had much difficulty with those pressures,
Um,
or no?
Honestly, not really. So I think I have noticed, I have noticed events like that at my university and at other universities, which have been sort of shut down by students or by the sort of student union. But I haven't experienced any of that firsthand. And
Mm,
so I don't know if it's just that I'm, I guess, more fortunate, but perhaps it's not as big of a problem as some people make it out to be, even though it is a problem, I think.
right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear that from a lot of people, like that everyone who's up in arms about political correctness is exaggerating, and
Hmm.
I hear that argument a lot from academics who often say, in my past X years of teaching and researching, I've never once had any
Right.
student complain about anything that was said. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's true. I mean, I think the people that are, the especially on college, on university campuses, the number of students and just people in general that are really obsessed or a bit paranoid about political
Uh-huh.
correctness issues, they are a very small minority.
Yeah.
they're just a very vocal minority. And
Yeah. I think
yeah,
that's right.
yeah, well, that's cool that you haven't had any problems
Yeah.
with that. Um, but is it interesting to you though, like how just genetics itself at all, like it's like if you do research on genetics and think especially things like intelligence,
Uh-huh.
which you kind of get your research gets rather close
Yeah.
to. Like, is it just strange to you how that itself is seen by a lot of people as like politically dubious?
Well, I guess I can understand why they would feel that way, but I think a lot of it is sort of overthinking all the ways that the research could go wrong or could be used in a bad way instead of trying to find sort of good avenues to push the research and to make use of it in a productive way. So I feel like a lot of people tend to think of sort of historical examples where this research has been used for bad and not think of the possibilities where it could improve people's lives substantially.
Right.
And
Definitely.
I think that is especially true with things like genetic prediction. So I
Mm,
sort of see prediction of traits as a way to like screen people and diagnose people with things before they might realize it otherwise, and then that allows them to sort of look for treatment or therapy earlier than they would otherwise, and that improves their lives. And it's very strange to me that people don't think about that possibility as much as they do about the negatives that could come from it.
right. Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, there are in almost all cases, having true information about one situation can only be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
There are, probably a few very unique and rare types of situations where having more information might actually be bad for you. But in general, I
Yeah,
think knowing things about genetic predispositions. I mean,
yeah,
what's interesting is like people's intuitions are totally different when you put it in terms of like diseases, right? Like
right. Yeah, yeah. That's
almost
exactly right.
everyone, yeah, almost everyone will immediately say that, of course, if someone is genetically predisposed to a particular disease, it's useful to know that in advance, and
Mm-hmm.
you would want everyone to have that information about themselves as soon as
Yeah,
possible. But as soon as you start talking about other types of life outcomes,
yeah,
people's moral intuitions get primed in different ways, and things start to get screwy. It's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
I
I think one of the most important takeaways is probably that um, it's not necessarily deterministic in the way that people assume it to be. So it's more of a guide of what could happen if nothing changes.
hmm,
But so, like, as an example, there might be genes that predispose somebody to being short-sighted or to having some sort of deformities in their hands or something. But if you sought out treatment for that, or if you just wore glasses, you could easily solve the problem.
right, right,
So yeah, I mean, I don't think of it as so. Um, I don't think of it in the fatalistic way that lots of people seem to do.
Right. Right, because it's just having information about a situation
Yeah,
that just it just increases options and increases the probability of selecting like the most effective options. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
it's hard to be against that. Yeah, I actually just recorded a podcast with a political scientist who studies public opinion towards genetic explanations.
Okay.
Yeah, she was really cool. I think
Hmm.
you might find much of interest in that. Her name is Elizabeth Suhe.
Okay, yeah, I'll check that out.
Yeah. The podcast was really interesting. Basically, I read a bunch of her research and wanted to pick her brain about it. Because
Uh-huh.
basically what she finds is that there's this widespread conception that genetic explanations are like a right wing phenomenon,
Right.
but it's not actually really true. Um,
Hmm.
it's that people on the left and on the right use genetic explanations for different types of phenomena.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah. I think that's
yeah,
true.
it's pretty fascinating. Like so, you know, people on the right are more likely to use genetic explanations for justifying or explaining away like racial and class differences.
Uh-huh.
But people on the right are less likely to use genetic explanations for things like homosexuality.
Right. Yeah.
So very interesting. She's kind of like an expert on all of this, and her research kind of points out, I think, quite interestingly, how genetic explanations actually are problematic for left wing and right wing kind of
Right.
worldviews because right wing people are all about personal responsibility,
Yeah.
and genetics undercuts that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and left wing people are all about kind of blaming social external factors,
Hmm.
social causes, and genetics kind of cuts against that too. So, yeah, I think it's just interesting. Genetics is kind of like a minefield for
Yeah.
people's like
That's right.
moral and political intuitions, I think.
Yeah. And I
Hmm.
find what I find interesting is that a lot of people find it a difficult topic to talk about with the average person. But for I guess perhaps it's just the way that I end up talking about it with people or the way that I phrase it. But it seems as though I'm able to have people really interested in it and find it sort of I don't know. Whenever I talk to people about behavioral genetics, they seem to find it really fascinating and not at all terrifying.
Yeah, right. That's interesting because that's also consistent with something that Elizabeth said, which is that, most people just are not really bothered either way about genetic
Right.
explanations.
Yeah.
Like what her research suggests is that uh, the the heated politicization of genetic explanations is mostly a media phenomenon. So she thinks that
Hmm.
like without without like motivated media messaging, people's attitudes towards genetic explanations are relatively just unactivated. Like most people just
Right.
don't really care left or right. Um,
Yeah.
and it's relatively balanced on the left and the right. It's only when you start exposing people to media messages that are making political implications from scientific studies on genetics or
Hmm.
whatever that all of the divergence and polarization among the left and the right seems to get triggered. So
Yeah.
I think I was saying to her that I think that's like a really useful kind of reminder. That's like a very much welcomed kind of cold water on
Right. Yeah.
like these hyper explosive kind of like political controversies, which just sometimes are so outsized relative to the actual kind of like scientific findings.
Yeah. One of the things that I find interesting is how people sort of assume that if something is influenced by genetics, that it must be that something that the person deserves to have, I guess. That it's sort of it's just
Mm,
part of who they are, and that means you can't change them, and that means that's just their personality, I guess.
right.
Whereas in other cases, so for example, I think in a lot of criminal cases, when people invoke genetics into, let's say, people will say this person has this. this gene that led them to be more aggressive than they would otherwise. And then they use that as an excuse to reduce the penalties that they would give the person.
Right.
So it's sort of it's very strange to me that both of these things sort of compete with each other, and it's not exactly clear whether people think that genetics is something that tells you how much a person deserves on their own, or if it's sort of a limitation that is to overcome.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's very, very fascinating when you start to break these things down, and you can't really. I mean, even when you think about them rationally, it's hard to. It's quite hard to develop a consistent kind of moral interpretation of all of these things
Yeah, yeah,
because there are some really competing trade-offs. And yeah, so
right.
it's like in public discourse, this is just like a dumpster fire of contradictory intuitions. Because it's like hard enough to even figure out exactly what the optimal kind of ethical stance is, even when you're like being super logical and rational about
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Well, Saloni, was there anything kind of on your mind that you were like dying to talk about or vent to the world before we maybe wrap this up?
Um, I'm not really sure. I don't know. Do
I
you think
wouldn't
there's anything we've missed?
I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be. I just like to I'm not necessarily in any rush. It just seems like things are kind of that was a fairly natural kind of bit of closure it felt like
Yeah,
on our fairly um, you know, chaotic and interesting journey through a bunch of different topics. I was just sort of giving you a totally open mic, just in case there was anything of interest to you on your mind that you felt like throwing onto the agenda. But
right.
if not, you
No,
know,
I
that's
guess
cool too.
not. No. Yeah,
That's cool. Well, this was really fun to chat with you.
yeah, same.
It's cool to learn more about your research and what you actually do.
Yeah,
Because, as I said, I'm a fan of yours on the internet, and we did get to talk once in person, but not for very long.
yeah, yeah,
So this was very worthwhile just to learn more about who you are and what you do and stuff like that. So
yeah,
thanks
yeah.
for sharing all of that.
And thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, totally. I hope it was at least somewhat interesting or fun for you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing all of your interesting reflections on these topics that I continue to be so intrigued by. And if you ever want to do it again, just hit me up.
Yep, sure.
All right.
Sounds
Thanks.
good.
Thanks a lot, Saloni. See you later.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.